right, good morning. Thanks for joining us this morning, everyone. Today's webinar is the first in the Understanding the Impacts and Risks of Building Envelope Upgrades, focusing on building science fundamentals and the importance of continuity of critical barriers. My name is Jenna. I'm a Built Environment Initiatives Coordinator with the Community Energy Association, and I'll be facilitating this webinar this morning with support from my colleague, Terry McConaughey. I'm going to give a quick introduction and then pass things along to our speaker this morning, Jeff Kirkpatrick with RDH Building Science. Right, so I'm joining you this morning from what is now known as Nelson, but for generations has been the homelands of the Kootenay, the Sinaiaks, and the Syilx nations. And I'd just like to start this morning off by expressing my sincere and deep gratitude for their generations of stewardship that allows us to enjoy these waters, forests, and mountains in the way that we do. As part of CEA's commitments to truth and reconciliation, I'd like to take this time to highlight a story of Indigenous leadership in the built environment space. So Musqueam Capital Corporation, or MCC, is the economic development arm of the Musqueam Indian Band. MCC is responsible for the development of Musqueam's lands, acts as an asset manager for Musqueam's real estate holdings, and facilitates partnerships for numerous business opportunities. MCC is developing a Lelem. It's a master planned community designed with the traditional Musqueam principles of inclusivity and respect that reflects deep-rooted Musqueam values of environmental stewardship and sustainability, and a richness of community that defines the Musqueam way of life. The development is a holistic way of living surrounded by nature and convenience, including a mix of housing types, urban amenities, abundant green space, public plazas, and encompassing Musqueam culture and art. So the development of 1,200 units, heating and cooling needs will be met by utilizing a Shark low-carbon wastewater energy exchange system as part of a centralized energy facility. So the unit's wastewater will be collected and passed through the Shark system, allowing for the reuse of thermal energy that would otherwise be lost to the sewer lines. So by using wastewater as an energy source, the project will significantly improve the energy efficiency and reduce the carbon emissions of the community for its lifetime. So there's a few links just at the top of the screen there. Feel free to have a look if you'd like to learn more about this story and follow their progress. All right, so Community Energy Association, who are we? We are a registered charity and nonprofit committed to accelerating bold action by local government and Indigenous communities related to climate and energy. So we are the only nonprofit in BC focused exclusively on supporting local government and Indigenous communities on climate and energy. So what does that have to do with building better? Well, CEA's work recognizes that the built environment is a main source of community-based greenhouse gas emissions, and that action in this sector can not only result in significant greenhouse gas emission reduction, but can lead to enhanced community resilience and energy security while increasing the comfort, health, and safety of our homes. So CEA has been involved in building industry education and capacity for almost a decade. And then on the following slide here, I'll introduce a few of our current projects. All right, so building a legacy, Kootenay Clean Energy Transition and Retrofit Assist are examples of some of the projects through which we coordinate and deliver various activities supporting contractor capacity development across BC. And it's thanks to these projects and the funders of these projects that we're able to join you this morning for this free webinar. So since 2021, the Building a Legacy North initiative is a collaboration between CEA and the Canadian Home Builders Association of Northern BC, supports high performance building through the implementation of the BC Energy Step Code and Zero Carbon Step Code in Northern BC. So Building a Legacy provides training and support for the building industry and local governments around the high performance building in cold climates in both new construction and retrofit. The Kootenay Clean Energy Transition, or KCET, is a project that was developed to assist Kootenay and boundary communities in preparing for a more energy efficient and healthy future by providing high performance building training and capacity building sessions like this one. And then finally, Retrofit Assist is a program that offers a full concierge service to guide homeowners through the process of completing home energy retrofit projects with optional financing available. So participants receive a list of Retrofit Assist authorized contractors when they're ready to hire for their work. So for participants using the program's financing, payments are made directly to the contractors upon completion of their work. So if you're a retrofitted contractor operating in the East Kootenay, Roslyn, Kamloops, Whistler, or Squamish areas, this could be an excellent business opportunity for you. So I'll share Terry's actually going to share some information in the chat on this, and then you'll see some of this information included in the follow-up email as well. And then so as I mentioned, we do have quite a few events going on. Sorry, Jeff, if you don't mind going back a couple slides there. We just have our website at the bottom there where you can see the full list. So communityenergy.ca/news-events. All right. Another quick plug here for the Home Performance Contractor Network. So again, if you're involved in retrofits, this is a network to be aware of. So for those of you working on heat pump installations, window and door retrofits, or insulation upgrades, if your clients are looking to access provincial and utility rebates, this is the program that you want to be involved in. So by joining, you'll gain access to industry-specific training, and then upon completion of the training, you may qualify for subsidies and reimbursements for the course costs. So you'll see the info@homeperformance.ca email address there where you can learn more. All right, and then finally, I'm just going to close with some housekeeping items before I pass things over to Jeff. So CEA, we're dedicated to offering an educational opportunities to all, no matter your current knowledge or experience level, and we prioritize creating a safe and welcoming environment for attendees to engage and participate. So if you have questions throughout today's webinar, feel free to raise your virtual hand, or you can pop your questions in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat and making sure that all of your questions are answered. If it's directly relevant to the presentation content kind of at that moment, I'll be happy to ask Jeff on your behalf. Otherwise, we'll wait until the end of the presentation where we'll have some time to answer some questions. We'll be sharing out a copy of the presentation slides and recording within a week of today's webinar. And then if you are collecting continuing professional development points through BC Housing, we'll also be sending out some emails, some confirmation of attendance emails to those of you who've joined us for the full duration of today's webinar. All right, so with that, it's my absolute pleasure to introduce Jeff Kirkpatrick with RDH Building Science. So Jeff is a part-time studies instructor at BCIT's Zero Energy Emission Buildings Learning Center and is a registered energy advisor actively working in the central Kootenay and Kootenay boundary regions. So we're incredibly lucky to have Jeff here with us today to impart some of his knowledge and wisdom achieved through 30 years of experience in residential and commercial construction. And with that, I'll pass things over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Jenna and Terry. Welcome, everybody. I appreciate everybody's attendance here to this morning. My name is Jeff Kirkpatrick, as addressed. I'm also here with James Bourget, a principal with RDH Building Science, to meet any questions or needs today. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional territories of the Sinex, Silex, and Ktunaxa peoples. A little legal jargon, I'm not going to read it out for you, but we all know what the point of that is necessary components in today's agenda. So what does a retrofit mean? What is a building enclosure, environmental loads and critical barriers, and retrofit considerations and options? So retrofitting as a definition from Natural Resources Canada, short form energy efficiency retrofit is an upgrade to energy consuming systems, or a retrofit definition, an act of adding a component or accessory to something that did not have it when manufactured or constructed, like our existing stock homes. Minor retrofit would be air sealing and insulation, upgrade lighting, potentially flow faucets, low-hanging fruit to improve improve our conditioned spaces. A major retrofit would be replacing windows and doors, updating mechanicals, installing submetering. Again, insulation and air tightness would be part of those metrics. And a deep retrofit, an extensive overhaul of the building safe systems, saving 60+% in energy costs and reductions. So deep dive into what these components are. In this case, air sealing and insulation upgrade retrofits. The process starts with assessing the options for improving the envelope. So ideally, an energy advisor would come in and like myself, and do a thorough evaluation of the building envelope components, and then through blower door tests, the performance metrics of the existing building's capabilities. Performing air tightness testing and sealing is usually the best place to start. Window replacement should also be considered based on their dramatic improvement of the conditioned space envelope. And adding insulation is usually the most work, but also the most beneficial. Insulation top-up priorities. What should we be doing before addressing the insulation? air seal first. We want to address the attic air sealing as a result of the stratification from the envelope and the load that the ceiling plane is accommodating in regards to keeping the conditioned space, and crawl space heating, generally where the fresh air intake is coming from in maintaining that conditioned space. So an insulation top-up work, accessible through attic. We're going to air seal penetrations in that attic ceiling plane. So whether we have poly or whether it's just drywall or lath and plaster ceiling, we want to address from the top down, all of the penetrations in the attic ceiling, and then adding the insulation to those areas. Crawl space ceilings, above a crawl space, vented, open, conditioned. We want to address the air sealing and insulation levels, as that would be the environmental separation over a vented or open crawl space. For upgrade walls, very difficult in an existing stock home. Air seal as much as we can, a airtight drywall approach, but adding insulation to interior walls is a blindside application and not always the most successful. Unless there is no insulation whatsoever in those walls, we're going to have to mitigate as much as we can. Insulation retrofits, same required, jump top. Exterior retrofits, obviously the ideal solution. Add a sweater and a windbreaker to our existing conditioned space. Or an interior retrofit when significant energy improvement is desired and an exterior retrofit work is not feasible. So crawl space conversion from a vented open to a conditioned crawl space. And insulation retrofits would be windows and added insulation. An exterior retrofit, obviously our best case scenario for adding that sweater windbreaker to any existing stock home. So vaulted ceiling, I can add exterior insulation to that element and reinstall a roof above grade walls. I can super insulate my exterior aspects of the wall and improve my air barrier continuity. Below grade walls, again, adding that exterior insulation is putting that sweater onto the outside and reducing the temperatures of my conditioned space. My crawl spaces, whether that be inboard or outboard insulation, but converting to a conditioned space in order to maintain that encapsulation of that environmental separation. Interior retrofits, why the exclamation mark? Because they're, one, incredibly difficult to do, two, costly. I lose floor space ratio by adding insulation layers to the inboard side of the walls. And then the continuity and the difficulty with all the interfaces within the building envelope and having that continuity through in order. So if I was to be able to insulate room by room, I don't have the ability to effectively insulate or detail that interface wall on the interior side. So we'll deep dive into what is the building enclosure. It is an environmental separation between the built or conditioned environment and our natural environment outdoor. The building science definition of applying the laws of nature to manage heat, air, and moisture across the building enclosure by climate zone. And that relationship is the critical element of defining what are our needs based on our demographics. Climate zones throughout BC, as you can see on the map here, these are our vegetation climate zones derived in the 60s. Not always applicable. In the case of Roslyn Retrofit, gets to use the Soyuz as their weather data. So working on that. But as a generalization, this will give us a generalized value as to what would be our insulation values or our heating and cooling loads based on those climate zones. So our heating degree days in a short form definition would be, we have roughly 8,750 days per year. And how many hours, sorry, not days, but hours, and how many hours per year are we below that 18-degree threshold, which requires heating or conditioning. Environmental separation, different exterior environments, varying interior environments and occupant loading, and building enclosure requirements by climate zone. The building enclosure separates inside from outside, keeps warm air in and keeps cold air out, and performance depends on the materials used and how well it is designed and constructed. The key phrase. So why the enclosure and first approach? Air tightness, thermal and mechanical, and the importance of them. So our existing stock homes and our cheese grater Here is an example of what our existing stock homes represent from pre-40s to 50s and 60s to the 70s and 80s and now into the 90s. We haven't been able to maintain that air tightness metric as well as we should. And so our existing stock homes require mechanical supplemental to maintain that conditioned space. And then the existing stock home with low air change performance or thermal insulation values has plenty of air leakage. And I need much larger mechanical to compensate for that air leakage. So as we say, there's two dials to adjusting the performance of any building. One is my TEDI, my thermal energy demand intensity, and that is my air tightness metrics and my insulation values or resistance to heat flow. And then my MUI, my mechanical energy usage intensity, which means that it's my mechanical systems to maintain the conditioning of that space at a temperature ratio. So I have those two dials. If I can't address my TEDI, which is my envelope first or enclosure first metrics, then I have to turn up my mechanicals to compensate. The majority of the rollout of the existing programs have only gotten people to be, accessible to putting heat pumps on cheese graters, as we like to say, which means that we're turning up the mechanical needs to compensate for the deficiencies in that enclosure. If I take away the air leakage and improve the windows, which is part of that air leakage metric, because the window openings have a air infiltration metric to them. So if I've got old single pane windows and I upgrade to a double pane window, and I add a little bit of a sweater to the envelope, I can effectively reduce my mechanical needs. And that is a very poignant conversation point in this relationship, is understanding where we are at that crossroads. I have an existing stock building. I need to improve my conditioned space for indoor air quality or health or comfort. Am I going to be able to address TEDI or MUI? And we'll continue in this conversation. If I do a really good job, I can reduce those metrics, those MUI metrics, even further. We'll look at the environmental loads and the 5 critical barriers. Environmental loads applied to buildings are water, rain, wind, air, whether that's a pressure differential between interior and exterior of the conditioned space, heating, outside environmental aspects of heating or cooling, and vapor, which is generated by mostly respiratory within the space. So for a body of 4 people in a home for a 24-hour period, can create 4 to 6 liters of moisture in the air. And that's just through respiratory. That's not including cooking, cleaning, showering, laundry, hanging laundry indoors to dry, adding moisture to that air. And in this relationship, as we can see at the base, at the bottom, we have a direct relationship and an indirect relationship. In this case, air has a direct relationship on the air barrier system. So an effective air barrier system is going to reduce the air infiltration or exfiltration from that conditioned space. Air is going to have an effect on heat, and air is going to have an effect on the vapor. So I like to refer to it as air is the Uber ride for heat, sound, and moisture. Vapor on its own is linear and not intelligent. Air is smart because of the pressure differentials created inside a space opposed to outside that conditioned space. And the air barrier also has a direct relationship on the water infiltration. In the case of an exterior air barrier assembly, that is also our water resistant barrier. We'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Heat has a direct relationship to thermal insulation, but it also has a relationship with vapor in managing the vapor drive through the assembly. It also has an effect on the water resistive. So if I add external insulation, then it's going to add to my water resistive protection of the wall itself. And vapor has a direct relationship with only the vapor retardant. Water has a direct relationship with the water resistant barrier and waterproof membranes and the water shedding surface. But to take away it all, the air barrier system is king as it relates to my water resistant barriers, my air barriers, my heat transfer through the assembly, and my vapor movement through that assembly. 5 critical barriers are our water shedding surface, which is the cladding assembly meant to keep 90% of the water out of the walls. Our water resistant barrier, which is usually the construction wraps, polyolefin films behind the cladding system, meant to stop incidental moisture from entering the conditioned space. The air barrier system can be either exterior, in this case, the green line on the sheathing plane, but it can also be the vapor barrier by default, which is generally our existing stock homes condition, our thermal insulation barrier, and obviously the vapor barrier. So 5 critical barriers that make up any wall, ceiling, or footing. So we go a little deeper. The water shedding surface is that outer surface that deflects or drains most of the exterior water. Water resistant barrier is the last surface that can accommodate moisture without getting damaged. The air barrier system of materials that stop airflow through the building enclosure. In this case, it's illustrated on the exterior, and in this case, illustrated on the interior. So we can see in this assembly, just in this photo, when we apply it to the exterior, we have a straight, clear wall with very little interruption penetrations. We can see on the inside here, I need to transition from my upper floor, through various materials, reconnect to my lower floor. It becomes very complicated, and this is where we have most of our deficiencies in our existing stock homes as far as poly by default as an interior barrier. Our vapor barrier, which is that poly behind the wall system, is a material that stops water vapor from getting into the assembly. That's from interior traveling out through the assembly. And our thermal insulation barrier slows down heat flow out of the building and heat flow into the building, our resistance to heat flow. Always remember effective water control, 4 Ds of moisture protection, deflection, which is that cladding surface, drainage, which is a rain screen cavity to promote drainage outward through the assembly. Drying is to allow that drying, whether it be in both directions through the assembly, or durability. We want it to be able to last. Deflection, again, through overhangs, cladding assemblies, flashing details, meant to keep most of that effect away from the wall assemblies. Drainage allows for incidental moisture ingress to be able to redirect out of the assembly at most interfaces, whether it be a floor band, window header, sill, penetrations within the envelope. We want to ensure that there's drainage and deflection away. And then drying. I want to make sure that I have an assembly that can accommodate drying in both directions for durability aspect. In the case of a roof, I need to ensure that I have airflow to inhibit drying. And in the case of an exterior insulated roof assembly, in this case, a flat roof, my inward drying potential. So I need to be able to make sure that I can identify what is the priority mechanism for drying in any assembly and make sure that I've got a robust system to accept that. Durability. I want to use treated lumber, treated fasteners, sealing the protection courses for all exposed wood components. I want to improve the durability as much as possible. And this is part of that, ascertaining what components and how should they be installed. So the concept of environmental separation, the 5 critical barriers and the 4 Ds of moisture control. Bring them all together, 9 considerations. So we've all heard the term take it to the nines, which is an idiom meaning to perfection or to the highest degree. Again, just to touch on the 5 critical barriers being the water shedding surface, the water resistant barrier, thermal barrier, vapor barrier, and air barrier, and the 4 Ds of deflection, drainage, drying, and durability. The vapor barrier is not the air barrier, as said. So vapor barrier is a function of coverage. I cover 90% of the walls without tapes or sealant. I have 100% effective vapor barrier. The air barrier is a requirement of continuity. So I need 100% continuity for it to be an effective air barrier. So taped and sealed, I create the continuity through that envelope. In this case, we're illustrating poly by default on the interior. We'll look at vapor diffusion and the impacts. So important vapor diffusion can lead to condensation on cold surfaces like sheathing. So when we take our pop can out of the cooler in a hot summer day and it condenses on the outside of the can, that's the cold surface of the can integrating with the warm, moist air around it and dropping the moisture molecules onto the cold surface of the can. So in this case, the same scenario happens within our existing walls, assemblies. So I have my interior moisture conditions, pressure differential within the wall. That moisture moves into the wall assembly and condenses on cold surfaces. So 20 degrees and 40% relative humidity on the outside of the building, or sorry, on the inside. The dew point of that air, we looked at a psychrometric chart, would be about 6 degrees. So any surfaces within my wall cavity that are at or below 6 degrees are a potential condensing surface. And majority of our existing stock homes suffer from this on a seasonal basis during those peak cooling periods where we have wetting within walls, but our walls are also loose enough to maintain a drying potential. We exist in a very fine balance of wetting and drying. It's when we upset that balance that we can exacerbate moisture problems, mold, funguses within our wall assemblies. Important, vapor can hitch a ride on air streams from air leakage and move through the assembly. So as I said, air is the Uber ride for heat, sound, and moisture. It's the pressure differential between the interior conditioned space and the exterior that is causing that movement in the wall assembly. So we can see here that we have interior conditions, high moisture conditions. The vapor generally is hitting the vapor barrier and maintaining the condition within the conditioned space. But if I have a hole the size of a loonie within my wall assembly, how much water can pass through that hole in a heating season? Up to 30 liters of water per season can pass through that hole into your wall assembly. It's very common, and it's out of sight, out of mind. A lot of us don't realize, but James and I have been ripping buildings apart for 30 years, and we've seen this impact. So I can attest to you that it is absolutely true in regards to this effect. In high humidity seasonal time, there is no drying without heat supply. A good air barrier can prevent this leakage, whether it be inboard or outboard, better off outboard, but it's not always perfect. What are some of the components that make up the air barrier? We have our penetrations, which are windows, doors, and we have the materials that cover a majority of the wall surfaces. And then we have our accessories that integrate those wall surface materials with our components to create the continuity through. So a window and the door, specifically windows, will have an air barrier or an air infiltration metric and a thermal value. And so we need to ensure that we have continuity through that envelope, because all of the components of that envelope make up the continuity of our air barriers. An exterior air barrier made with common materials, in this case mechanically attached synthetic sheathing membrane, vapor open, or interior air barrier, common materials are polyethylene vapor barrier by default. And an air barrier, typical accessories, tapes, sealants, intumescent putties, EPDM gaskets for penetrations through that air barrier assembly, and self-adhesive membranes for a robust tie between the similar components. The 4 principles of an air barrier. Number 1, most important, it must be air impermeable. In a retrofit scenario, what is the air barrier system? So again, we had the pre-1940s, 50s and 60s, 70s and 80s, all different periods throughout our history where our buildings have adopted. And what material in those existing stock homes is would be your air barrier in your current situation? Continuous. Continuity is the key. So we look at an existing retrofit home. How is it constructed? What is that air barrier material or materials that make up that assembly? In this case, if it was an interior air barrier assembly, we can see by this illustration that we have numerous penetrations, interfaces, difficult areas to transition an air barrier and maintain that continuity. We know that a poly by default air barrier assembly is a diminishing product over time. A recent publication of study of 78,000 new homes state that an air barrier, an interior poly by default is diminishing product by 38% in the first 15 years of its lifespan. That means every time a new ownership of the home is putting wing-back anchors in the wall, making modifications, new vanity bathroom mirrors, we're making penetrations in that interior air barrier, but we're not effectively resolving or maintaining the integrity of that air barrier. Third principle, durable. It must be durable. what existing components provide the best plane of air tightness in the existing stock home. So I can tell you that anything pre-80s doesn't necessarily have an air barrier, even though it's always been part of our building code, must maintain a plane of air tightness. So what is the air barrier in an existing stock home, let's say pre-70s building? It's more than likely your drywall finishes. And the fourth is stiff and strong. So it must be able to resist environmental loads or loads on the building. And what again are our options in an existing stock building for the durability of that air barrier and its components? And if we're doing a deep energy retrofit, what are our options? So moving that air barrier to the outside is putting a windbreaker on our home. And it's very effective because I have a lot less penetrations, a lot less interfaces and details, and I can easily apply a more consistent exterior barrier than an interior. The environmental loads from the inside and exterior will have a dramatic effect on the integrity of that air barrier assembly. We can use components like wing or cap nails to increase the air tightness of the penetrations of the fastening of that exterior air barrier assembly, or just vertical strapping in order to keep it mechanically attached to the building effectively under wind loading. Plenty of wind loading effect, even on a built environment with cavity wall, lots of wind loading within that cavity space. And uncontrolled air leakage. And here's an example of the cap nailer. Comes integrated with the caps themselves, which get hammered into the assembly and put a staple utilizing a small cap as the component that, so when I press this cap on through the staple, I actually make that penetration more airtight. So I'm improving the durability and the integrity of that airtight assembly, especially during the construction process. So lots of components and materials out there to improve that installation process. Uncontrolled air leakage, we can see in this illustration, is very important for my aspect as an energy advisor local to the Roslyn retrofit and the Kootenay programs. I test buildings on a daily basis, and I see this scenario in real life every day. It's a little bit concerning in regards to indoor air quality. So uncontrolled air leakage in this case, as I heat and condition an existing space, that heat stratifying through the envelope, it's putting pressure on that attic plane ceiling, and I have air leakage at top plates, penetrations, interior wall interfaces through that attic plane ceiling. If I don't have dedicated fresh air, that air is coming from somewhere. So as I move that air up through the assembly, through the heating process, it's pulling in new air to compensate for that air movement. In this case, it's pulling through rim joists, headers. One area that's not illustrated is the top of the footing walls at the sill plates. Very common area for air infiltration. So uncontrolled air leakage is not what we want. That's the heat pump on a cheese grater. Controlled airflow leakage, outdoor air pulled into the house through an HRV or ERV with filters. So in this scenario, if I had a robust air barrier assembly, then my only indoor air, my source of indoor air is through that HRV or ERV recovery unit, through filters. I've got 2 HRVs in my house. I could have a forest fire in the backyard. I wouldn't know in the house because I've modified some of your 13 filters to filter that air coming in. So this is, as far as indoor air quality, is a major benefit but it requires the conditioning of the envelope to be effective. So for those of you that aren't aware of what an HRV is, it's an air exchange, the heat exchanger in the center. I don't know if you're familiar with coroplast, the sign material. It's a fluted material. So it's 2 sheets with fluting in between. And the orientation in the heat exchanger is a matrix of layers of coroplast that are put in opposing directions. So my existing ducted air from inside, exhausting through that matrix, transfers the heat energy through that matrix to the oncoming air from the fresh air coming in from outside. So it's transferring that heat energy through that matrix to the inboard air coming inside. And what that does, if I was to pull cold air in from outside, I had 0 degrees outside, and I'm trying to condition my space to 20 degrees, I'm raising the delta T of that into that temperature from 0 to 20 degrees. If I have a heat exchange or a heat recovery ventilator or an energy recovery ventilator, then I'm recovering 70% of that heat energy as I'm exhausting. As it's coming in, it's preconditioning that air with that heat energy, and I'm only raising the delta T of the interior temperature by 5 to 10 degrees. So a lot less energy is required to maintain that conditioned space. So benefit one, I have fresh filtered indoor air. Benefit two, I've only needed to condition that air nominally opposed to that full rise of temperature. Filters, so most of them are going to be like a MERV 8 to 9 filter, but we can put up to MERV 13 filters within an HRV. An ERV, sorry, I should have touched on that. An ERV, the difference between an HRV and an ERV is also recovers the moisture in the air. So unfortunately, I only have HRVs, and I can't keep my interior environment above 30% relative humidity. An ERV is going to help in those dry environments, especially if we use supplemental heating as like a fireplace, or dry heating, electrical resistance heating, forced air through baseboards or forced air. We're going to want to maintain enough humidity. We want to be in that ASHRAE zone of 37 to 57% relative humidity inside the space for optimum indoor comfort, as well as conducive to our mucous membranes. Again, a robust exterior envelope is going to mitigate all of that incidental air leakage and those effects of indoor air quality, and then rely on the HRV, ERV as my air exchange. So what's happening here? When we pull walls apart, we see our pink insulation. We've got some black staining around penetrations within that wall assembly. This is poly by default as air and vapor barrier. Is it water ingress? Is it the insulation moldy? Or is it air leakage? Or is it all of the above? So what we're seeing is in that black staining is moist, dirty air passing through the walls, whether it be from interior to exterior or out interior or exterior to interior, in this case, mostly from the exterior to the interior, is accumulating in those insulation layers. That's the lungs of your current existing stock home. That's where our indoor air quality comes from. How's the air quality in your home? So for better thermal performance, more insulation. Our existing on the left is our stuffed interior walls, and on the right, a wrapped exterior. So an exterior air barrier. Oh, sorry. We can go to double stuffed walls. So double stud walls, Larson truss walls. We can increase the insulation value of the existing stuffed wall. In this case, a super insulated wall. Cellulose filled. In the wrapped version, we're going to add exterior insulation, exterior air barrier. Depending on my demographic, I just add more exterior insulation to meet my heating or cooling needs. Where do you place it and what insulation type matters? I'll just mention on this slide, actually, we'll talk about this again coming up here shortly. Vapor permeance of various insulation. So on the chart on the screen here, the green areas are vapor open. The orange is our vapor closed product. So in dry cup performance, we can see rigid mineral wool has a dry cup permeance of 49.5 perms, whereas a open cell spray foam has 30.1. Interesting to note that closed cell spray foam or polyiso facers are vapor open for the first 1 inch of product, but anything over that becomes vapor closed. EPS, which is your expanded polystyrene or your popcorn insulations, are vapor open up to 3 inch, but obviously reduces the vapor permeance or the vapor flow through that product the thicker you go. More interior insulation means colder sheathing. So again, our fat walls, so the far right example is that super insulated 14-inch passive house fat wall. All I've done is made my sheathing plane colder. So if I have incidental moisture and air leakage within that wall assembly, which there is no perfect environment, then I am still at risk for moisture condensation within that wall. It also takes longer to dry out. If I go to a 2x6 wall at the middle example, I increase the warmth of that wall as assembly, but I'm still cold and I'm still getting condensing. In a typical 2x4 wall, my wall is warmer through the conductive elements. So that stud factor, the continuity of the drywall, the studs and the sheathing in close proximity with a low resistance to heat flow, because I'm at an R14, R12, or maybe a 1950s R8 wall. And so that exterior wall is warmer, which increases the drying potential. If I add more exterior insulation over on the left there, I move that condensing plane further out of the assembly. I'm warming the sheathing in that process. So we'll look here at the far left. No exterior insulation with batt insulation. The dew point in that wall is about, in this case, -8. So the surface of that, or sorry, not the dew point, but the surface of that sheathing plane in this condition is -8. And we have a condensing at 20 degrees and 40% interior relative humidity at about 6 degrees. So 1 inch of exterior insulation. So I've warmed that sheathing a little bit. Now my sheathing temperature is above 0. The 2-inch exterior insulation with batts, my sheathing plane is now warmer and I'm above 5 degrees. I'm at that 6 degree mark, which is, getting close to the risk zone of condensing surfaces. But I've eliminated that to my exposure throughout the year. Adding 4 inches moves that sheathing temperature up to 9 degrees. And again, 6-inch exterior insulation with no batts within the wall assembly puts my sheathing temperature at above 15 degrees Celsius. So absolutely 0 risk for any condensation within that assembly. So somewhere between 4 and 6 inches of insulation is sort of a key element of being able to create that robust assembly. So the water resistant barrier water shedding surface in a retrofit option, install new windows. But what about the existing water resistant barrier on the wall? So depending on the age of the building and the application, but typically you're going to find anyway pre-80s is going to be a black felt paper, asphalt paper within the wall assembly, not an air barrier, as it's a lapped product. So what should be considered to maintain the critical barrier continuity today and for the future for deep energy retrofit upgrades? Install the window membranes using an exterior air barrier, water resistor barrier approach, and tie into the existing water resistor barrier beneath retained cladding. So I'm able to install a window into an existing building, but I'm going to install the components of that window and the makeup of the membrane layers so that I can accommodate tying into them, whether it be on the inside or the exterior of the building in the future if that building goes through any exterior upgrades. So I want to make sure that whenever I install a component now, with the premonition that I'm going to be able to tie into them in the future, as well as making them, resistive and durable. We want to be able to tie in future deep retrofit exterior air barrier into an exterior air barrier at windows and doors. So potential areas for a typical retrofit upgrades: attics, easy and very common. Compact roofs are much harder. Vaulted roofs, cathedral roofs, much harder to address. Walls, cavity fill, or exterior insulation during siding retrofits, more extensive and costly. And floor headers, bay windows, exposed floors, and other locations of missing insulation depends on access. So I can tell you right now that there's numerous homes of existing stock that have no header insulation whatsoever. Voids, pockets. I use a thermal camera on every evaluation, and I can see missing insulation within wall cavities, voids within the roof assemblies. Or another very important one is the top plates of the wall, which don't have any protection course, is a infill stud wall insulation. There's no protection course at my top plates, and we've seen a number of conditions where we get down to the double digits cold, and we get frosting on the interior of the buildings at the top plates and the ceiling plane. Windows, highly impactful on that conditioned envelope. and fit out foundations and slab on grade. Most challenging and expensive as a result of there's no insulation under slab, which is a condition at my house and extremely cold floors. And but I do have tall ceilings, so I'm able to add insulation inboard and then refloor the assembly. So there is options, and it's being able to do a thorough assessment, understanding the components and the performance values of the existing building, and from there deriving what is the best case scenario moving forward, whether it's an interior retrofit or an exterior retrofit, and then crawl space is heated or vented. Let's consider the critical barriers in a retrofit upgrade. The older home, where is the air barrier? What could be acting as the best plane of air tightness? So we have a couple of photos on here of existing stock buildings, various ages, build design qualities. As an existing stock building without the continuity of an air barrier, the best plane of air tightness, unfortunately, is the drywall. So in older home retrofit improvements, likely no dedicated air barrier system in older homes, interior air sealing through roofs, attics, walls, doors, penetrations, and below grade. Attic targeted air sealing, duct penetrations, exhaust fans, perimeter top plates, combustion exhaust penetrations through the ceiling, recessed pot lights, attic hatch, masonry chimney, ceiling bulkheads, top plates. These are all very low hanging fruit that a professional or homeowner can address today and reduce their losses. The attic flash and fill spray foam air sealing. So doing a 2-inch lift or 3.5-inch lift, covering your cords in your attic space as a spray foam application gives us a reasonable air barrier, a reasonable vapor barrier, and our value to that, and a continuity. The most critical aspect is that continuity throughout the attic space. But we don't want to fill the thing entirely full of spray foam. You can do a loose fill on top of that, get yourself to that R50 mark. And now I've dramatically improved the resistor barriers of the interior of the building, but I've also added substantial insulation, which helps with my cooling effect. In the summertime, with that heat transfer down through the assembly, attics can get excessively hot in the summertime, and that heat energy is transferring down to the cold surface of the walls, which are the interior where you're trying to condition with your air conditioner at full blast. So you're fighting a losing battle without that resistance to heat flow in the attic space. Important considerations for attic work: air seal first. The air barrier base material is either the back side of the interior finished drywall or the existing polyethylene or something else such as tongue and groove boards. You'll find a lot of craft batt up inside your attic spaces, and the facer on that was your vapor diffusion layer. Localized spray foam does not stick well to polyethylene, so use tape and sealant. Dowsil 758 is a suggested product instead, or a flash and fill approach. The spray foam does not handle the interstory drift or the seasonal loads on the organic nature of the building. And so it doesn't have the elongation to stay adhered to those inside corners of, say, my roof joist, my drywall plane, and my plates at the perimeter. I'm not going to get an effective seal through all three of those XYZ directives. So I need to make sure that I can transition from those components. So we use a product like Dowsil 758 here in sausage form for a bolt gun for doing it in quick applications and covering quickly. There's some local contractors that have some products that are a spray form of these products, where they can go in with a spray gun and actually create those transitions between materials. The 758 the sealant allows you to bridge and create not a 90-degree inside corner, but a radius corner, so that the spray foam is adhering to the one surface, the second surface, but the sealant in that transition is creating the elongation. So if these components are able to move, the sealant is going to allow the bond to the spray foam to maintain its integrity. Important consideration, I'm checking the time. Jenna, on it? Important considerations for attic work: air seal first, localized spray foam, and keep all combustible materials clear of hot combustion exhaust surfaces. So that can be a metal shroud, that can be using mineral wool to bridge those areas. Superficial air sealing from the interior surface of the ceiling is less effective, but can work if needed, which is the airtight drywall approach, which you'll find directions in regards to the airtight drywall approach through Enercan's Keeping the Heat and the BC Housing Retrofit Guide, available online. Just give it a quick search. If deep retrofit work is planned, consider converting the attic space to a conditioned attic, which allows for mechanical placement or ducting and things in the attic. A below-grade air sealing: deal with the moisture first, concrete cracks, foundation drainage issues, etc. I can't express this enough. It will cause exacerbated problems if it's not addressed. Keep crawl space ventilation and less converting to a conditioned space. If I'm going to not condition my crawl space, I need to look at the floor as the ceiling, as the plane of air tightness, as well as my thermal boundary. Below grade air sealing: sealed slab membrane for moisture and air. Again, these can be EPDM gaskets, polyethylene, plenty of materials on the marketplace. Slab repairs and sealant: those are cracks and areas around penetrations. For crawl space, I'm going to insulate the headers robustly so that I'm not getting that heat loss through that very common area. And wall miscellaneous sealing, so make sure that we're sealing up any penetrations for conditioned base crawl space. Seal existing windows and doors. Seal from the interior only to avoid trapping moisture. Do not seal operable portions. Apply sealant to joints and perimeter, and consider replacing gaskets, special work, not adjusting the hardware. And sealing existing doors and windows: add replace bulb gaskets around doors, avoid brushes, consumer grade foam, weather stripping, and the hardware on doors leaks excessively. A recap on critical barrier continuity and considerations. So consider what is the scope of the retrofit work. How would the critical barriers be affected? The retrofits can be phased over time, and what does this mean? Mudrooms, porches, garages are part of the air barrier. What is your air barrier strategy for localized retrofit work? And what about for a deep energy retrofit? And don't forget about the hazardous material considerations. Extreme air tightness requires makeup air, backdrafting potentials, combustion gases within the home, and an HRB, ERB. Discussion, questions?
All right, wonderful. Thanks, Jeff. Thanks for giving us that thorough look at the importance of the continuity of those critical barriers. Appreciate it. Folks on the call, we do have lots of time for questions. We had a couple come through the chat. So I'm just going to move my questions over here. All right, so Natasha just shared when you were showing that table within the data on the different types of air sealing, of insulation. Natasha just said that she'd love to see some of those insulation numbers for alternatives like light straw clay and straw bale, as well as the same grade comparing embodied carbon impacts of each of these material insulation options. So just wondering, Jeff, if you're aware of a resource out there where they can...
2 years ago did start that resource. The city of Nelson, Mike Cohen, who was previously doing the low carb consulting. So I believe there's still some reference, some access to resources through the Nelson. Obviously, sorry,
and Alex LaFar.
Alex LaFar, that's right. Would be the contact for that now. There is through the BEAM, Builders for Climate Change, lots of access to the information, so you can actually use the BEAM calculator for those purposes. So there is a calculator for assessing your envelope components and what that impact would be.
Great, thank you. And folks, I'll include those resources in the follow-up email as well. Great, so Patrick, I do see your hand up there. We just had one more question in the chat throughout the presentation, and then I'll call upon you. Just going back to, you were looking at the impact that exterior insulation can have on the temperature of the sheathing plane, and Natasha just asks, you mentioned that 4 to 6 inches of exterior insulation was ideal, and is that on a 2x6 assembly or a 2x4?
Your split insulation ratio, there's a number of metrics to it. Preferably, as far as the ideal wall to me would just be a 2x4 wall because it's effective in that sense. I don't need a 2x6 wall. If I have an existing 2x6 wall, I'm still going to move towards those, to that 4 inches or 4 to 6 inches on the inside. I take into account my interior volume of insulation, but that's only because I need to ensure that my window components, door components are within the insulated assembly. So, depending on your demographic, it's going to dictate through a hydrothermal wall analysis how much insulation you ideally want on the exterior wall.
One of the things that you can consider is between a 2x6 and a 2x4 wall, no matter if you both put, for example, 4 inches of insulation on the outside, the 2x6 wall will be 3 degrees colder than a 2x4 wall. And you think about why? Well, the heat source is inside, and you have more resistance to heat flow in the wall assembly, the studs. And so the sheathing is actually cooler. You get a better bang for your buck on a 2x4 wall.
Great, thank you. Folks, that's James Berger in the background there, popping in and helping out answer some questions. We can't see you, James, but all right, Patrick, go ahead. I see you have your hand up there. Go ahead and unmute and ask your question.
Yeah, sorry. I'm wondering what's your track record with older home renovations, and what are you recommending? When I say older, because I look at all the slides all the time on these retrofits, and they're showing nice trusses. In our neck of the woods, we got like 1900s minor shacks that people are wanting to renovate. I'm on the design side here a lot, and we're doing the exterior blankets and stuff, but every time I hit up a rafter framed roof, we hit pretty much a brick wall with the structural engineers that are saying, oh, if you're going to add insulation there, you're adding structural loading. Basically, these rafters are not engineered to hold up the load of the snow load, so therefore we always end up with the thing where you have to rip up the roof and put in an engineered either truss package or I-joist or whatever we're going to do. So it ends up being often projects just end up not going forward because they're like, oh, okay, well, I didn't really intend on ripping up my roof, or we end up stopping at the walls, but then you got the leaky ceiling still happening, where then the client just gets reluctant in adding insulation in these old rafter rooms. I've tried negotiating with structural engineers for, hey, can we just add a bunch of plywood gussets on these rafters and stuff, and not many are really collaborative in doing stuff like that. I'm just wondering what's your track record?
Well, and from somebody who's been through these processes before, as part of the discovery process initially, before we break ground, that we assess those structural capabilities. That snow load, metric is obviously very important for public safety. So we want to make sure that we've addressed what is the capability of the existing structure in the discovery process. It is not impossible, and I'm saying that from somebody who's reinforced plenty of roofs and added, improved that snow load rating. But you can, if you're not able to do the conditioned attic aspect in that sense, then obviously you're just going to transition from the walls, from the exterior, through the top plates, over the top plates, to that ceiling plane, and then create your exterior, your air barrier assembly with your insulation values in the attic plane. So it's either a flash and fill, a non-conditioned attic space, or if you're really eager to have that conditioned attic space, which I think is a huge benefit to the performance metrics of the home, but as well as addressing that additional floor space, I'm surprised you're having that much difficulty with the process, because it's not that difficult to come up with a spec to reinforce. I have had problems in the very old in the 40s buildings, based on the fact that you're missing half the components necessary, but it's not out of the realm of possibility. And so far we've successfully revitalized many existing buildings in that format.
It's not a significant load adding insulation.
Yeah, and James has made the point that it's not a significant load depending on the insulation product that you're using, and you're not generally going to put rock wool on the ceiling plane, so you're going to end up with your EPS polyisos that are much lighter. So you're not dramatically, loading that roof component. But again, it's going to matter on the integrity, like you said, the old ski cabin or something like that wasn't built for code to begin with.
Well, yeah, that's exactly what I'm talking about. Like, I'm up in Rosslyn here. We have many homes. A big portion of our housing stock is, 1900s. There is no, they're board on board, laid, walls. They were just kind of thrown together, not really meant to be lived in, and they're just, people are just extending the lives of these old homes. So yeah, interesting.
Great. Thank you, Patrick.
Right.
All right, a couple other questions in the chat. Chris had two, so I'll start with the first one here. Do we need thicker exterior sheathing and specialized fasteners for 6-inch exterior insulation?
The principle is that you need a minimum 3/4 of an inch or 19 millimeters embedment on any fastener to support cladding or insulation. So if I don't have my 3/4 inch exterior sheathing, then I'm looking for studs for all of those components. The idea to having the 3/4 inch exterior, so I would, ideally a perfect wall in my mind would be a 2x4 wall with 3/4 inch sheathing. That way, I'm not looking for studs, and I can minimize what's referred to as your chi value for the conductive element of all of those fasteners required to support cladding and insulation layers. So I want to reduce that as much as possible. So I want to put as little fasteners as possible to support, structurally support that. So going to a 3/4 inch sheathing dramatically improves my ability to install the products with a minimum amount of fasteners. Oh, and then the other one is interior intelligent membranes. Well, they're really smart when you put them on, but after that home is occupied by a number of homeowners and they painted the walls a number of times over, my membrane doesn't require being smart because I already have a vapor barrier. 3 to 4 layers of latex is a vapor barrier.
Great, thank you. And Kimberly asks, what assembly would you recommend for an existing cathedral ceiling where the existing roof is not being replaced? In this case, it's a newer metal roof.
2 options. One, you can always do continuous insulation and ensure that your existing cavities don't have voids of insulation, and you can do an interior continuous insulation layer over a cathedral vaulted ceiling, but it requires re-drywalling over that finish or reapplying any, an aesthetical finish to that. That's really, apart from, being a metal roof, it's not too difficult to re a metal roof as well. So you could always do that exterior insulation aspect and re those existing roof components.
Great. Oh, perfect. One more question popped in the chat here too. And folks, feel free to keep popping your questions in the chat. I have a couple of questions too. I don't see any more in the chat, so we'll continue this discussion. Galen asks whether you've experienced issues arising from partial air/insulation upgrades in renovations. So say that only 25% of exterior walls were opened up and upgraded and the remaining walls remain untouched. So any issues arising from scenarios like those?
Absolutely. Inconsistent cooling. So the metrics working on your building are conduction, radiation, and convection. So your assembly by default, so if you were to take a thermal camera around the inside of your building, generally you're going to see all your studs in your walls and all your framing components through the drywall layer. And that's a function of our interior condition is a function of our not ambient air temperature, but our surface temperature. So when I'm heating a space, all of the surfaces within that home are absorbing that heat energy before it's radiated back to me in the space. If I always have a conductive element, in this case, your stud wall through the, my insulations that are my drywalls attached to studs attached to the sheathing's attached outside. So I'm always have a conductive element. If I have, irregular wall assemblies, I'm going to be concentrating that, to the colder surfaces. So all the heat energy is going to go to the colder surfaces first. So that again, thermal insulation and air barrier are the 2 components that require continuity. That is the critical term when we refer to any insulation or any air barrier assembly. It must be continuity.
Great, thank you. And so just speaking of the continuity of those critical barriers, I was just hoping that you could could take us through kind of what types of retrofits or upgrades, maybe not specifically focus on the building envelope, but that accidentally impact the continuity of those barriers and how that can be avoided?
Windows would be the most critical aspect of that. Windows, doors, any penetrations within that assembly would be the weakest link.
Okay. And say we're installing a mechanical system too. Do you see a lot of that? Yeah.
The penetration. So, you're going to need your fresh air intakes for mechanical systems, your penetrations through the walls, and ensuring continuity through those penetrations.
Okay. What's the best way to ensure continuity through those penetrations?
Gaskets, sealants, not relying on spray foam as your connection material. We need something more robust in order to make those connections between penetrations or envelope components.
Great.
The windows are a particularly interesting topic. And if you're going to change your windows, and you can phase the work, obviously, maybe you're going to do the walls later. You can put the windows in with an exterior air barrier approach, which laps over your exterior water resistor barrier, but also ties into your current interior air barrier. I know that sounds like a lot, but the point of it is, if you install an exterior air barrier with a new window, at the time when you do a retrofit, remove cladding, put on a continuous air barrier to the outside, you can tie into it. We see a lot of times the windows go in with no consideration to future enhancements and improvements of that structure. That's a bad decision.
And as an energy advisor, I follow the contractors around in the post retrofit, and I'm seeing a lot of deficiencies in regards to windows still.
Okay. Great, thank you. Maybe something to focus on future workshops too. Casper asks, would you have any advice on maintaining continuity on an interior air barrier across floors? So the main to basement, main to second floor, etc. The wall to ceiling is simple enough, but he struggles visualizing a good way to transition through a floor.
Are you referring to vertically through the floor or horizontally? Because at your floor line, if you're not dealing with a finished floor and you're in renovation status and you've got that plywood floor exposed, tapes and sealants can transition you through horizontally through an assembly. If I simply was to transition down my wall assembly and I come down my stud wall to my framed floor, sealants are between the plates or your wall material or your drywall and airtight drywall approach. I transition to the floor. Plywood is an air barrier. I can't blow through plywood. So as long as I come to the underside, and again, this is very critical when we're doing energy upgrades, I want to transition through that header or rim joist area with the air barrier continuity, which is sealants and gaskets and tape to step myself through that assembly. But also the insulation value needs to align with the wall above, needs to align with the floor and be a consistent value through the floor header.
The baseboards and you connect to the floor.
Yeah, if you pull the baseboards and you're connecting from that floor to wall transition, then you've already created the first step at that floor level. Now I just need to go underneath and continue down from that floor, from that plywood sheathing.
Great, thank you. Michelle, I see you have your hand up there. Oh, you're just muted. We can't hear you.
Apologies. You may have discussed this because I came in late, so I'm sorry if I'm asking a question that's already been addressed, but it was about windows. So I did a retrofit and Jeff was extremely helpful. And I think my windows are very, very tight. And it is very cold here. I'm not sure how cold it is by you guys, but it's -20. The kids are home from school today. Very cold, -20, 25 something. And it's the first time we have not adjusted our heat. I use Rockwell exterior insulation, so I can vouch it is very, very good. We have not raised our heat at all, even in these sub-zero temps, but the windows are condensating because I can't get my interior humidity low enough. And we did a ton of, like what you just spoke to, the rotting caulk and the continuity of the air barrier and the windows being tied in and doors being tied in, and I'm stumped.
You know, it's not an envelope scenario, because what you've done is built a robust envelope. So now you've encapsulated what was before incidental air leakage, carrying that moisture with it. So it's a function now of occupant loading. I'd be curious to know, Michelle, what your air change rate metric, if you were to do a blower door test, because that sort of dictates if you've managed to achieve more than 2 to 2.5 air changes or less, then you're going to need the mechanical systems to manage that moisture content through occupant loading. Like you say, the kids are home, so you're lots of heavy breathing in the house this weekend, and plenty of moisture generated in the assembly. So you're going to need the mechanical systems to address. So that's either an ERV or your existing forced air mechanical systems to compensate for that that moisture load. So it's a function of ventilation and mechanical systems.
I had a feeling that's what you were going to say.
Sorry,
An important point when we're all doing all of these fun retrofit. Good to get it at the beginning if you can, but yeah, thank you.
Great, thanks, Michelle. That was going to be my next question too, is kind of at what point should we consider those mechanical systems? So you said 2.5 to 2 air changes or less?
That's my metric based on my experience. I'm not sure exactly what the ASHRAE or even ASTM requirements would be, but generally the consensus is anything under 2.5 air changes, I'm definitely going to want to look at dedicated fresh air. Again, the other aspect of that, if I tighten up that envelope, the example we give is if I had a 6-sided box with a hole on each side, and I plugged up 4 of those holes, I have concentrated effect at the remaining 2 holes. But if I have an HRV or if I've addressed it within my mechanical ventilation, then I can mitigate those moisture loadings and the impact of that concentrated effect.
Great, thanks. Thanks for the question, Michelle. Anyone else on the call with a question for Jeff? Just give it another second here. And thanks to those of you who completed the poll. I really appreciate it. All right, Casper has another question. Somewhat specific, that's no problem, Casper. Do you have specific concerns about embedded floor joists in a masonry wall, which then gets insulated and air sealed?
It's a great question. I'm actually going through this scenario currently. I'm doing a little bit of a deep dive investigation into this, into one specific location in Rossland, where the concrete was poured with the first floor buried in the joisting, buried in the wall, and you can see the evidence of rot. So again, the metric, it's the physics, it's the science that will highlight exactly what the scenario, what the impact is. In this case, you've got those warm interior components, in this case, the 4 joists, that are conductive and sitting in that assembly. So again, we're going to have problems at those cold surfaces. And that's where, that dew point change, if I have air leakage or that conductive element, I'm warming that concrete surface, which is directly adjacent to a cold surface, a -20 day, say, as the example was mentioned, you're going to have some impact at those floor joists embedded in those. It's not a protection force being embedded in the concrete by any means.
Masonry or
it's dissimilar materials. It's wood in contact with masonry. It's a highly problematic scenario.
Great. Oh, and Casper just shared that he believes one of the solutions was to install metal plates to actually conduct heat to the base of the joist at the wall to keep it warm and help manage that moisture.
Definitely one of the trains of thoughts. It's one of the theories. I can't honestly say, James might have some insight, but I can't. This is not a tested scenario because it's not a highly common. I mean, out here in the Kootenay is a little bit more common with the age of our homes, but it's not something that's been tested and vetted. So I really couldn't say what is the best case scenario, but you're on the right track with trying to pull some of that conductive element out.
Great, thank you.
Full masonry and insulate outside.
Yeah.
All right, Jane, Heather, and Zach, I see you have your hand up.
Yeah, thank you, Casper, for bringing that up. We're actually got a retrofit that has that exact same scenario, and we are wondering what the best way to manage that is. So we have an our solution that we came up with was, okay, we've got the wall, and then we've got the inlet, and then so we were going to do and it was the mostly vapor open. I believe the manufacturer said it's 85% vapor closed. So we've got a can spray foam. It's the Acfix spray cans that go on the gun with the fan. So the fan tip. So we're gonna go R24, that 4.5 inches up to that point, and then just go down to an R12. So a lesser amount to still let that drying potential happen, but without creating that pocket up at the top of going, okay, here's the cotton, here's the cold, and now we've got condensation there. So are we on the right track with that, or would you recommend something else? Like, how do we deal with
obviously,
that?
I mean, the question started with what is the best case scenario, and the best case scenario would be to insulate the exterior. Now your problems are completely eliminated. Anything on the inside is going to be mitigation and risk adverse. So there really is no end all. I would definitely, as illustrated earlier in the presentation, caulk all of those XYZ transitions before spray foaming those areas. I would avoid the spray foam if I could, but intimacy and depending on your specific, the surface irregularities of the concrete itself, how much undulation is there, in creating intimacy with. I mean, that's where the only benefit that spray foam has is ideally in basements with very irregular surface walls or stone or rubble, footings, where you can't apply an insulation and get a good intimacy to the product. Spray foam can achieve that intimacy, and that's really the only reason why you're using in those applications. From what I'm understanding, and I've loved, obviously pictures speak 1,000 words, and it's a lot easier to understand. But
Jane, do you want to grab the file?
Oh, which one?
The one with the we put in a building permit application, so I did a little hand drawing. I can show you.
Yeah, well, I'm the idea that you're going to reduce the insulation values at the joist connections is what I heard.
Yeah. So our original thought was to only go up to this point here.
The mass masonry wall,
Yes, is
And then
You have to put your hand
see
to
your-
just your fist. Oh,
Is
raise your.
it a mass masonry wall?
Pardon?
Is it a mass masonry wall, like all masonry?
I
Multi-wide, like it's several layers thick of brick making a wall.
no, this one's actually concrete.
just the footing.
It's just concrete.
What's above
Yeah.
the footing grade?
Above it transitions to the wood floor.
Okay, but your floor joisting is below the top of the footing wall, so your joisting is buried in the concrete?
Yeah, it's inlet into the concrete, just straight into it.
Yeah, okay.
So just so you know, no matter what you do to the inside, your drying happens from the inward outward, and follows heat flow. Jeff talked about that. If you insulate the inside, you reduce drying, because when it's in an absorptive product like concrete or masonry, it takes water from the outside. The sun comes out, even though if there's any solar in it, dries moisture inward. And so your drying potential is greatly reduced. If you don't treat it from the outside, it's correct that it's all going to be a mitigation of risk. You can reduce your R value there, but you're still reducing the heat flow that helps dry it out.
Are you gonna have
Right, I see.
basement walls? Are you gonna be finishing the interior of the basement?
So this section is actually a tiny little section here, and then
Oh,
the rest
right,
is a
right.
walkout basement here. So this is a teeny tiny little crawl space. It's like a three feet to crawl up and in there. But the rest is just a walkout basement, and it's mostly unfinished right now, but it does have the potential.
Because the last time I came across this scenario, the other option would be to frame an interior wall and remove the components from the concrete. Right, so you frame an interior support wall to support the load of that floor, and remove the components from the concrete, fill the holes.
Okay.
It's an easy answer, but it sounds facetious, and I'm being a smart ass, but ultimately, I like durability in everything I do. I want it to be bulletproof. It's got to be 100-year resolution. And we're very risk adverse. We come from a building science firm, engineering backgrounds. We are risk adverse. So leaving the assembly in and trying to mitigate it sounds.
You switch inside, outside.
Yeah, well, yeah, that's another option. I mean, to finish that point is the structural component. I don't know if we can actually see it.
Yeah,
But basically what we're saying is if I have my insulation on the interior come up, I transition to a band of insulation that's going to lap
4 times
Yeah,
the thickness.
4 times the thickness. I've drawn it quite small here, but it would actually be, so I can transfer my insulation value from inside to outside.
And back to inside if you
But
like.
they need to lap over each other. So I need this.
I see. Okay.
To lap over that insulation on the outside because I'll get a thermal gradient on the angle.
4 times the thickness of the wall. If you do
Yeah.
a bypass, then you can put a flashing at the base of your wall. If you're not going all the way up with your exterior insulation, you simply put a cross cavity flashing,
You would be
And-
flashing at this
and
layer,
you'll take away that problem.
Okay, I see. So focus on the outside. I got it.
100%.
I like that better.
Yeah, and you're welcome to contact us at any time and get a little more thorough direction and be able to see your drawings because I can't see yours.
Okay, will do.
Appreciate it, Heather. Thank you.
Awesome. Thanks,
Thanks,
guys.
Heather. Oh, another message there. All right, Michelle asks, would you say in general, if you can do a retrofit with insulation, best to do on the outside rather than the inside?
The basic concept is that our existing stock homes were not designed to be to one, mitigate the climate change expected, nor to even effectively meet our consumption needs. We need to reduce our consumption values. Energy was cheap at the in the 80s, and we just threw more wood, coal, or and electricity or gas at it. Now we have to be more cognizant. So the reality is, if I want to improve the performance value of my building, a sweater and a windbreaker, everything in nature requires the control layers on the outside. Trees, bears, dogs, cat, everything. You and we all got up this morning and put our control layers on the outside. So existing stock buildings need a sweater and a windbreaker. That's really the bottom line.
Great. All right. I think we're going to wrap it up there, folks, unless, well, we're saying goodbye. There's another question that pops in the chat. Seems to happen every time. But yeah, thanks so much, Jeff and James, you two in the background there. We really appreciate your presentation. Oh, actually, before we go, Jeff, can you give us a little sneak peek into part 2? Folks, you'll find the registration link for part 2 in the follow-up email if you haven't yet registered.
A little bit more in regards to the lessons learned of what we're seeing out there. And then the impacts of that on indoor air quality, on comfort and health, and so basically a deep dive into a little bit more of the impacts of the changing metrics of the building enclosure and what to expect, as well as what are the negative effects of the not good job, well done job.
Great, thanks. All right, so as I mentioned, folks, we'll have those links in the follow-up email, as well as some resources that Jeff pointed to today. And yeah, thanks for all your great questions. Thanks for sticking around this morning, and thanks, Jeff and James, for your great presentation and insights.
Awesome. Thank you guys and everybody who joined us today.
Thank you.
Okay, take care.
Take care.